story about that song. I don't sing it very often. The first time I ever heard it was Perry Como.
Really?
Yeah. And so I was, I've been, when she said she wanted to hear it, I was kind of going over it in my head and remembering it. And obviously it's written in Latin. And I studied Latin in school. And I spent the Christmas holiday with my daughter and her 2 children. And they're Catholic. And they do this wonderful thing every night. And they do the prayers. And the 3-year-old says, "More prayers, please." Okay, what prayers did you have in mind? "Hail Mary, please." I have never done the Hail Mary, but I know the Latin. So I'm translating in my head so that we can do Hail Mary for the 3-year-old. So there we go. And Magnificat, yes. Magnificat means magnifies. Magnifies, that's the actual translation. And it's the shorthand for "my soul magnifies the Lord." My soul magnifies God. Magnificat. So, magnifies. Nice. Love it. Today is the 3rd day of Christmas, and we'll sing about that later. We'll just do verse 1 through 3, and then we'll skip to 12, okay? Don't want to wear you out. But it's also several other things, okay? There's a reason there are 12 days of Christmas. Do you know there are 12 days of Christmas? Yes? And they start December 25, and they end on Twelfth Night. That's Shakespeare's play. Twelfth Night is the 12th night after Christmas. And in my family, growing up, the Christmas tree went up on Christmas Eve, and it came down on 12th night. And there was a big party, and all the Christmas goodies got eaten. And that's it. We were done. No more carols, no more food, no more decorations until next December. It worked very well. And the reason that 12th night is so important is because it took that long for the wise men to get to Bethlehem. The next day is Epiphany. And I will be here the Sunday after Epiphany, but we won't be talking about Epiphany. So we'll talk about that a little bit now. So the next day, the morning after the 12th night, is the day when the Magi, which is referring to Persian, Zoroastrian priests, come to Judea to see this foretold King of Kings in the Hebrew tradition, this Jewish Messiah. Isn't that interesting? The very first Christmas was interfaith. I love it. So these Persian magicians that are sometimes called kings, because in the Persian tradition, the wisest people are the leaders. That's an unusual concept, right? So these magi show up and they say, "Where is he that is born king? For we have seen his star in the east, and we've come to worship him." Wow. All right? In the Jewish tradition, the Judaic tradition, you would never worship a person. You know, it's Yahweh. That's the only thing to worship. And the ark is the presence of Yahweh. That's where he's located. He sits on the mercy seat. Okay? That's the only reason that the ark is there. And so this is a totally different concept being introduced by the Persian influence. All right. So having said that, and you can all go through the We Three Kings song in your head. This is a good time. Yes. And they bring 3 things: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay, the gold is to honor not only this royal presence, but remember what we learned about gold last time? What is gold about? That's right. You bring gold things at the solstice to remind yourself that the sun is in fact returning, that the light is present in the darkest time of year. Okay? So that's one thing. They bring frankincense. Frankincense is an interesting thing. I had never encountered it. The incense they used in various services I attended was never frankincense, so I didn't know what it was about. But it's this marvelous, marvelous chemistry that when it is lit and you smell the smoke from it, there's actually an enlightening of the God spot in the brain. It wakes up that part of the brain that is in touch with the all that is. They call it the God spot. It's where people go into mystical states. So frankincense encourages the mystical state. And in the song it says frankincense is of a deity nigh. It lets you know there is a God at hand. And then myrrh. Myrrh is another of those wonderful herb kinds of things. And myrrh wasn't always in the ointment being used to help someone get over certain kinds of illnesses, but it was always used to help preserve the body after death. So in the song, we're told that myrrh reminds us of the tomb. And those of you who are familiar with Mary Magdalene are aware that she carried an alabaster jar with ointment, and myrrh was one of the ointments in her jars. So, in her jar, her single jar. So, as we look at this nativity, this birth, and the celebration of it by people from other places, we're aware that there is something that is happening that is more than just one religious group's exploring a possibility, coming into a new level of possibility. I wrote my Christmas letter, and I got it posted on my website, but I didn't get it emailed. And one of the things I talked about, so you can go to my website, RuthLMillerPhD.com, but one of the things that I talk about is, what I mentioned last time I was here when we said that at the solstice, at the winter solstice, we're looking for the birth of a new way of being. We're looking for that, welcoming possibility. And this child becomes a symbol of that. But the other point that I make is the Jewish tradition that has these prophecies written in them, it's the very, very first time any writing included the possibility of a future different from the past. There's a wonderful book called The Gift of the Jews that explains that if you want to. But it's literally the very first time anyone wrote the future is going to be better because of what we're doing now. Or the future is going to be awful because of what we're doing now. Okay, because the prophecies were written, Isaiah and Jeremiah and those guys. So, someone wrote it down. Others from around the world came to visit, to celebrate that this possibility was unfolding. Something new was happening. And then we have this silence for 12 years in that story. And that's some of what we'll be exploring for the rest of the spring, is that 12 years between this birthing time and the beginning of a new kind of ministry. So, that's that part. But all of this happened inside something called the Roman Empire. And it happened very soon after Julius Caesar's protege, Octavius, was declared emperor and declared himself to be Augustus. August. Yeah, he's an Augustus being, right? Emperor Augustus. And he declared the Pax Romana. He stopped all warfare and all piracy in all the countries, all the areas around the Mediterranean. Can you imagine what that was like? After centuries of constant warfare on every boundary, and after not knowing if you were going to make it from one side of the Mediterranean to another because someone else is going to go out there and do you in, okay? That's the world he inherited, and he created a world in which people could travel safely, and all kinds of things could happen, and guess what? As a result, all kinds of things did happen, right? We had ideas and news traveled quickly and easily. People were moving all over the countryside, having a wonderful exchange that hadn't been there before. And that's actually part of probably why the Magi could show up in Jerusalem when they did. And then in Bethlehem. So, news about this event and this child and this being who becomes a man and starts doing all these strange things was able to spread very quickly through Rome and throughout the empire, and ultimately become the basis, along with the empire structure, for life for Europe and much of the Middle East for this past 2,000 years. And that period is coming to an end. And in fact, it is over. And we're going to see more and more evidence of it being over through the rest of this year. So that'll be kind of interesting. Now, one of the ways that that period has come to an end, it's been going on for just about 50 years at this point. We are in this, it's a 75-year period. If you look back at Augustus and Jesus, it took about 75 years for Christianity to become spread in some way through the empire, and for the empire to become the norm throughout the Mediterranean and Europe. Okay? When you look back at American history, there's this wonderful quote that we go to war in 1775 and someone says, the revolution has begun. And John Adams says, no, actually began about 15 years ago, but we're finally seeing it. And if you look at the history of the shift from the kingdom, where the king and all the power is up on top, at the top of the hierarchy, to the democratic republic, where the power is, ostensibly anyway, at the base and works up, and the other people are working for the power base, the people, that shift from king to democratic republic took about 75 years, from 1775 to 1850 in Europe and America. Fascinating. We're in that same kind of a thing. So in 1965, something happened. The baby boomers grew up. In 1965, that was the first of the kids who were born at the end of World War II coming into maturity. They turned 1920. Okay, the war was over in 45, 65 is 20 years later. The largest number of teenagers in the world's history. No wonder it was weird. And it there's a positive reaction. And it showed up in a number of weird ways. Now, I was a teenager in 65, and I remember some of the things that happened that year. One of the things that happened that year was the Watts riots. The whole civil rights movement had been made official, had been established, all of that. It was happening, but it wasn't happening in a way that could be felt in the heart of the inner city. And there was this huge explosion in Watts, and it went on in a lot of other places, okay? Well, there was a young man who was finishing his PhD in 65 in Southern California. He went on to be a professor of African American Studies at Cal State Long Beach. I got to meet him. Nice man. His name was Karenga. That's his last name. And Dr. Karenga said, we need some way to have a cultural identity. We need some way for African Americans to understand that we are Africans living in America. We may be American citizens, but we have a heritage from Africa. You know, it's kind of like the Norwegian Americans and the Polish Americans and the Irish Americans. There wasn't anything like that for people of African descent. So he literally created in 1965 and celebrated for the first time in 1966 a holiday, an African holiday, Kwanzaa. And it starts the day after Christmas, the 26th, and it goes through New Year's Eve. It's basically this week. We are in the middle of Kwanzaa. Okay. I have a lovely little book. I didn't write it. A lovely little book explaining Kwanzaa. And the way to begin recognizing Kwanzaa is to say in Swahili, habari gani. Habari gani. What's up? Habari gani. Okay? And I normally put out the candles and everything, but we were so focused on this 12 days in this Christmas period that I didn't this year, maybe next year. We'll do the Kwanzaa celebration. Would that be good? Okay, cool. So what he created had nothing to do with winter, because where is it winter in Africa? Yeah. So what he created was a harvest festival. Okay? The reason oranges are a part of northern climates, Christmas thing, is because they're round gold balls. Right? That's why they're part of it. Where they came from was Africa, and sometimes Spain. Right? So it is a harvest time in much of the continent we call Africa. And what he said was we need to have a set of candles, kind of like Hanukkah, because it is still solstice, right? It's still that dark of winter, so we're going to have a set of candles, and each candle is going to represent something. And I want to share with you just a little tidbit of what this is, because I love what these represent. I grew up in an inner city in Chicago. I was the only white kid in my 5th grade class, and I lived in the inner city in Portland and helped to make it, transform the abandoned derelict houses into low-income housing. So this is familiar territory for me. We have a number of small organizations in Portland in the 80s and 90s that were designed to help kids at risk. And each of them had one of these words as their name. And the first one is umoja. Umoja. Unity. To work together in peace with our family, our community, our nation, and our race. Umoja. The next one's much harder. Kujichagulia. Kujichagulia. And it's harder, too, to live it. Self-determination. To make up our minds to accomplish the goals we set. Self-determination. The goals we set, self, to make up our minds to accomplish determination. Ujima. Collective work and responsibility. To learn together to solve problems together and make our community a safe and productive place. Ujima. Ujamaa. Ujamaa. Cooperative economics. To build and maintain our own stores, shops, and other businesses and profit from them together. Thank you. The easiest, shortest word is N-I-A, Nia. Nia. It's purpose. It's the holding of the vision. It says to have a plan for the future and be willing to help others to succeed. Nia. Can you see, if you were a community that hadn't had an identity, what would happen if you spent a night each year focusing on each of these ideas? Kuumba. Kuumba. Creativity. And that night is a wonderful night because everyone makes things. They have raw, whatever the raw materials are. People bring in pencils and papers and scissors and things, and they make interesting things. And or they may make baskets or all kinds of things. And my favorite, imani. Imani. Faith. Faith. To believe with all our heart in our people, our parents, our teachers, our leaders, and in righteousness. Righteousness, Iman. And it says, this little book says, Dr. Karenga hoped that the things that were studied and practiced during Kwanzaa would guide African Americans all year long. There's a proverb that's often quoted during Kwanzaa celebration. I am because we are. Because we are, I am. Blessed be. So we have a history. I'm not quite there yet. We have a history in the whole of the European and now African American communities of celebrating this period, the solstice, to some point in January. We call January 1st the beginning of the year. say that it's the New Year's. And you may recall that, do you remember when you were little there was this old man and a little baby? I don't see that anymore. Does anyone see the old man and the little baby anymore? Right? The old man is Saturn. It's Saturn. And in the Roman period, Saturnalia was the period between the solstice and 2 weeks later. 10 to 14 days later. And then the new year began. Okay? Janus, January, is the guy with two faces. He looks forward and back. So this is the time when we look back and complete, and we look forward into the new. But Saturnalia is the period where all the rules are off. It's an extended Mardi Gras. Right? Imagine Mardi Gras going on for 2 weeks. Okay? And again, gold things and jewelry on trees was part of Saturnalia. On every plant around the house, they would decorate it with all kinds of pretty, brilliant, beautiful things. Okay? And Saturnalia was a time when things were topsy-turvy. And it varied a little bit. It was kind of right on the edge. It wasn't that the slaves took over, but they were encouraged to act like they were in charge. So what would happen is the family would make a meal for the servants. And then the servants would be served by the family. And in some cases, there would be decisions made by the head steward as if the head steward were the head of the household, and so on. And it varied a lot by family. Of course, every family has their own variation on every tradition. But there was this sense of turning things upside down, where the people, the slaves, the people who still were, quote, owned by, and in Rome it was totally different from anything you've heard about American slavery. So, I don't quite have the words for it. But, the people who were, quote, owned by the others would take care of or be in charge of or would be acting like they were totally free. And this was Saturnalia. The world is upside down. Also, there were no dates during this period. So nothing that happened during this period was recorded in any diary or legal structure. So there was nothing institutional during Saturnalia. Now, some emperors would try to shorten this period because it was a little out of hand. But people didn't like that much. So they would go ahead and they would do it again. Right? They do it as long as they wanted to, as long as they could get away with it. And as the empire began to fall apart, then the festivities continued as a reminder of, oh yeah, this is what it was like when we were in the empire. We had this capability of enjoying life and having this great festival that went on for days. Well, as Christianity began to move across the empire, it was during the time when the empire was falling apart. Have you noticed that? Constantine, in 325, calls the Nicene Council because he has moved the capital of the empire from Rome, where it is no longer safe, to Byzantium, Constantinople. Right? He's creating Constantinople. We call it Istanbul today. You all know the name, the song, the little song? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so we have this little town that is now the head of the empire, the seat of empire, while Rome is falling apart. And the barbarians are coming in and taking over, and that's a whole other story. And what has happened is Constantine is counting on this religion that cuts across all caste and class to hold the empire together. And so he creates this as the empire's religion, Christianity. So Christianity is spreading through the empire as the empire is falling apart. And these bishops, who were heads of small groups of people, little groups of people, they might have 4 or 5 churches each, or family religious groups, or they might have as many as 12 or 15. Wow, right? Well, now they were living in the Grand Temple of Rome. They were on Palatine Hill, and they were somehow responsible for making all this happen. And believe me, they were scared. They were afraid. They had no idea how to do what they had just been told to do. Anyone remember the Peter principle? Everyone gets promoted at the level of their incompetence. That's what happened. That's exactly what happened. And these poor guys, terrified, didn't know how to do this. And they tried all kinds of things. And I told one of the stories last week about Winifred and the first Christmas tree, right? So St. Patrick is one of those stories too. We'll get to that in March. As we look at this process from that perspective, a polyglot nation, an empire, all kinds of languages, all kinds of cultures, all kinds of religious traditions, trying to be bound together by one religious tradition, where the emperor himself can no longer hold it together, the armies cannot hold it together. The structure of the empire, that bureaucratic structure that the Romans were so good at, no longer worked. Can you see that allowing 10 to 14 days of everything being topsy-turvy was a little too much? Yeah. So what happened was, province after province, Saturnalia was canceled. To the point where when the Protestant Reformation happened a few centuries later, okay, like 12 centuries later, it was so not okay that the Protestants literally made it illegal. Now here's a little bit of irony. The American Christians today are furious because the American government is not saying that this is a Christian holiday and only a Christian holiday. Christmas is about Christ, right? The Puritans would have put them in jail or in the stocks for celebrating Christmas. The original American Christians did not believe that we should celebrate this festival that comes from Saturnalia during this holy, church-oriented time. So Christ Mass absolutely is about Christ, the Mass of Christ. But the holidays, the ceremonies, all the celebrations of ceremonies, those kinds of the family traditions, have never been and were not accepted for the first 100 years, actually 150 years, that the U.S. was being occupied by Europeans. There were a few people in the South, the Chevaliers, who were the sons of lords and ladies from England, who had inherited lands, who had been granted lands by the king and queen in Virginia and in Georgia and the Carolinas. They had a quiet party because they were nobles, and nobles had always had parties at this time of year. But the rest of the country, it was, all those colonies, it was not okay. Isn't that ironic? Yeah. So today we're being told we're not okay because we're saying this is not just about the Christ, when 150, 300, 200 years ago, 200 years ago, we might have been put in jail if we had partied and said it was about the Christ. Oh my. All of which, the Zoroastrians being the guys who come and see Jesus, the Jews being the first people to suggest that there is a future, the emergence of the adopting and adapting of different traditions into the Christian story along the way, the hanging on to the solstice in spite of everything, all of this, the creation of a new kind of holiday, just so that there is a sense of deep history and roots for all people in this country. All of this is what we are celebrating right now. For me, the brilliance of this time of year is the lightness, the light in the darkness. The points of light, the brilliant light in the darkness. It doesn't matter whether I describe that light as a baby in a manger, as angels singing, as shepherds having a vision and heading for where they think that is going to unfold. It doesn't matter whether I honor that as a bonfire in the dark night, watching the sparks play against the dark sky. It doesn't matter whether I light candles 8 nights or 6 nights or every night for 25 days. It doesn't matter. What matters is not the form, but the content. We celebrate the light that is always present, no matter how dark it has seemed to be. Thank you.